So at this point, you should have chosen an image you want to use. And what I would really encourage you to do is move that image into the project folder, the digital coloring folder. Let's pre-name it right now. Last name, first initial. I'm just going to abbreviate this, dig color. All right. And then I'm going to drag and drop my image onto the Photoshop icon. And now it's open. First thing you're probably going to want to do is go to the Window menu, go to Workspace, and make sure that Essentials is selected, and then select Reset Essentials. And then we can make changes to our palette configuration. One of the things we're going to want is we're going to want color and swatches, so we can click and drag that out. And of course, the other one we're going to want is layers, so I'm going to click on the tab and drag that out as well. And then I'm going to minimize some of these areas that I don't need to free up more visual real estate. I'm just going to click and drag and move these out of the way. And I'm going to click and drag on the bottom of the layer palette to expand it out, because we're going to be loading this up with layers as we add color to our image. So the first thing we're going to want to do is make this image black and white. And there's lots of different ways we can do that, but we're going to use adjustment layers. So the first thing I'm going to do is go down to the bottom of the layer palette, and I'm going to click and drag and select black and white. All right, and what's nice about using adjustment layers, and I'm just going to close that palette, is that it's non-destructive. I can always turn off that layer, and I get the color version of my image back. One of the things we almost always want to do with our digital images is adjust the brightness and contrast as a very basic and fundamental first step. So again, rather than going into image adjustments and making a permanent change, I'm going to use an adjustment layer again and select brightness and contrast. And when I do that, I get this little panel that pops up where I can make adjustments. I can click and drag. I can get rid of that palette when I'm done. And again, I can turn that on and off, and I can even double click on it and change those decisions that I made. So it's a very versatile way of working in Photoshop, a non-destructive way, which means we can always go back and make changes. So I'm just going to boost up my brightness and my contrast so that I get some nice hard lines to color into. So one of the things you can be doing a lot of is zooming in and out. So rather than always going to the magnify tool at the bottom of your tool palette here, a faster way of accessing those same controls is by holding your space bar down and your command key. And I'm just going to zoom in. So space bar, command, and I see the little zoom tool, so that means every time I click I can zoom in. And if I just want to zoom out a little bit, spacebar, command, and option, and then I can click. And just a little bonus tip, if I'm really zoomed in on an image and I just want to move my view of that image over a little bit, rather than using these scroll bars at the bottoms and the sides of the window, I can just hold down my spacebar. My cursor changes to a grabber hand, and I can just click and drag and very precisely reposition my image within that screen area. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit, and I've got my adjustment layers, and I want to make sure that any new layers that I create are on top of my adjustment layers. So to do that, I'm going to click on my top layer here and then add a new layer. And I'm going to recommend that you're going to be using at least 20 colors in this, and I'm going to recommend that perhaps you create a separate layer for each different color. It doesn't necessarily matter where you're positioning that color or placing that color in the image. So I'm going to start off with green. So I'm going to name my layer green. I'm going to make sure that it's selected, and then we're going to talk about actually applying color. Right, so I'm going to start off by demonstrating with the paintbrush tool. Now we use the eraser tool a lot in the first tutorials that we did, And the paintbrush works the same way. We can change the size of the paintbrush, the hardness of the paintbrush, and we can also use our shift click trick. So with my paintbrush selected, the next choice I'm going to make is what color do I want to use? And I have my swatches palette that has a pre-defined set of colors. So I just return my Photoshop colors to their defaults, and you'll notice that when I click the bendy arrows, the foreground and background switch out. So I'm going to select my green. I'm noticing that black is on top, so I'm just going to click that bendy arrow to swap so that green is on top. That means that's the color I'll be painting with. One of the things you might want to do is change your layer opacity to something less than 100%. This will allow you to partially see through the area that you're painting, so you can make sure that you're painting just the areas that you want to target. So I'm going to change my opacity to, let's say, 65. And then I'm going to grab my paintbrush. I'm going to take a look at the size of the brush, and let's say I want to start coloring in some of these bricks. This is too big, so I'm going to move over here, and I can change my size by using the slider. I can also place my cursor in that field where it's saying 11 pixels, and I can use my up and down arrow keys to make more precise selections. And when I move my cursor over my image again, it shows me how large that brush is. And then I'm going to use the shift click trick. So I'm going to click once to let Photoshop know I want to start coloring that area. I'm going to hold my shift key and click, and I get a nice straight line. I'm going to hold my space bar and use my grabber hand to move my image down a little bit. I'm going to hold shift and click again. The last point I clicked on was in this corner, and now I've clicked on this corner. I'm holding shift, click, click. So now I've got a nice outline of the area that I want to color in with this green, and I could like click and drag and color it in. I could keep using my little shift click trick, right, to keep adding straight lines of color. But an easier method, I'm just going to go back in time a couple of steps by pressing Option Command Z. A faster way might be to now change to the Paint Bucket tool. Now the Paint Bucket tool shares a spot with the Gradient tool, so if what you're seeing is Gradient, we click and hold, select Paint Bucket. And we can use the Paint Bucket tool to color in areas as long as they're really well defined. So this area is really well defined with that green, so I can click and add that in. Boom, boom. And then I can move on to coloring my next brick. So that's one way we can approach this, and you might want to mix and match some of these different techniques of filling in areas depending upon what they look like, if they're really regular and even, etc. We're going to take a look at one more technique you can use, is by using our polygonal lasso tool. So it shares a spot with some other variations of the lasso tool, but I'm going to ask for polygonal. And when you're using the polygonal lasso tool, you simply click where you want to create lines. I'm not holding any modifier keys. I'm just clicking wherever there's a corner, because these are a nice straight selection that I want to create. And I always want to finish off by clicking on the first place that I started. And you'll know if you're in the right spot because you're going to see that little icon change to the polygonal lasso icon. And there's also a little circle, which means if I click now I've got an active selection. If I have an active selection, I can fill in that selection, and I can use my Paint Bucket tool again. Done. So you have a couple of different ways of approaching this coloring. Use whatever makes the most sense for the area that you want to color in. After you've applied a certain color to a layer, later on, what you can do is you can return the opacity to 100%, and then you can play around with some of our blending options like darken. I'm going to zoom out so we can see the effect. There's multiply, and sometimes there's not going to be a big difference between one and the other, and sometimes there will be. Sometimes a difference that you don't want. We have screen, we have all sorts of things. So this is a great opportunity for you to play around with what some of these different blending modes do and how they can affect how the color interacts with the image underneath. So I think now you've got enough to get you started with this project. Use whatever methods make the most sense to you.